A copper coin drops onto the counter, buying exactly 1 hour of warmth. Clara stares at the freezing fog pressing against the shop window, her fingers blistered from needle pricks. She expects another day of tailoring oversized waistcoats for pompous merchants. Instead, a carriage bearing the crest of the Duke of Haworth halts in the slush. The footman doesn't ask for the master tailor. He points directly at Clara. Her life of quiet obscurity ends with a single bizarre command. The bell above Mrs. Gable's shop door didn't chime. It choked, muffled by the thick layer of soot that coated the brass. Clara Miller didn't look up. She kept her head bowed over a bolt of bottle-green worsted wool, her heavy shears gliding through the fabric with a harsh metallic hiss. Outside, London was a miserable painting in shades of charcoal and grey. The year of our Lord 1816 had brought a winter that felt like a punishment. The Thames was freezing over. The poor were freezing faster. "Watch the seam, Clara. You're drifting," Mrs. Gable snapped from her perch by the iron stove. The proprietor was a woman who hoarded warmth like a dragon hoarded gold, her bulk wrapped in 3 layers of knitted shawls. "The chalk line is straight, Mrs. Gable," Clara replied. Her voice was flat, devoid of the deference her employer craved. Clara was 24, an age that in the rookeries meant you were either married, dead, or hardened into stone. Clara had chosen stone. She had survived by being the fastest, most precise seamstress in the shop. She didn't have time for fawning. A heavy, authoritative knock rattled the frosted glass of the front door. Not a customer's polite tap, but a demand. When the door opened, the freezing fog rolled in, clinging to the ankles of a towering footman dressed in immaculate midnight blue livery. Silver buttons caught the dim light of the shop's single oil lamp. Mrs. Gable practically fell out of her chair, her shawls tangling around her legs. "My good sir," she wheezed, attempting a curtsy that her knees vehemently rejected. "How may Gable's tailoring serve the Duke of Haworth?" The footman ignored her. His eyes swept the cramped, lint-filled room, passing over the 2 younger girls shivering in the corner, and landed squarely on Clara. She had the heavy shears suspended in the air. "You," the footman said. His voice was gravel. "Are you the one they call the iron-fingered girl?" Clara slowly lowered the shears. It was a nickname she despised, born from her ability to sew through boiled leather without a thimble. "My name is Clara Miller. The Duke requires your services. At Haworth House. Immediately." Mrs. Gable gasped, her hands flying to her chest. "Oh, surely you want me, sir. I am the master tailor. The girl is merely a cutter." "The Duke asked for the girl." The footman stepped aside, gesturing to the door. "Bring your tools. The carriage is waiting." Clara didn't ask questions. Questions cost time, and time in a freezing room cost heat. She folded the bottle-green wool, laid her shears, chalk, needles, and a spool of heavy black thread into a wooden box, and tied her thin woolen cloak around her shoulders. She stepped out into the biting cold. The carriage ride was a silent transition between 2 different worlds. Clara sat on velvet squabs that probably cost more than she would earn in a decade. She didn't let herself marvel at the luxury. She knew how the aristocracy worked. They only reached into the gutter when they needed someone to handle something dirty. A botched alteration for a secret mistress. A torn gown from a scandalous night out. She braced herself for an arrogant lord demanding a miracle. Haworth House did not glitter. It loomed. Set back from the street in Mayfair, it was a massive Palladian fortress of pale stone, heavily guarded by iron gates. Inside, the silence was absolute. The footman led Clara up a servant's stairwell. She noted the lack of carpets, the bare stone steps, and down a long, dimly lit corridor. He knocked twice on a heavy oak door and opened it without waiting for an answer. "The seamstress, Your Grace." Clara stepped inside. The room was a vast library, the walls lined with books bound in dark leather. A fire roared in the marble hearth, finally thawing the numbness in Clara's toes. Standing by the window, staring out at the frozen gardens, was Roland, the Duke of Haworth. He didn't look like the caricatures printed in the penny dreadfuls. There was no powdered wig, no ostentatious cravat. He was tall, lean to the point of gauntness, dressed in severe black broadcloth. When he turned to face her, Clara felt a jolt of surprise. He looked utterly exhausted. His eyes were dark, shadowed by sleeplessness, and his jaw was covered in a rough shadow of stubble. He did not look like a man preparing for a ball. He looked like a man standing at a graveside. "Leave us," Haworth commanded. The footman vanished, pulling the door shut with a heavy click. The Duke walked over to a massive mahogany desk. He didn't offer her a seat. He didn't ask her name. He simply reached behind the desk and hefted a stained, coarse canvas sack onto the polished wood. It landed with a dull thud. "Are you the fastest needle in the district?" he asked. His voice was low, clipped, carrying the unquestionable authority of his rank. "I am the most precise, Your Grace," Clara said, keeping her chin level. "Speed is a byproduct of not making mistakes." Haworth studied her for a long moment. He seemed to appreciate the lack of trembling. He untied the thick rope, binding the top of the sack. "I have a commission for you. It must be completed in 3 days. You will not leave this house until it is done. You will sleep in the adjoining room. You will speak to no one of this work. If you do, I will ensure you never thread a needle in London again. Do you understand?" "I understand threats perfectly, Your Grace. What I don't understand is the job." Haworth's jaw tightened. He reached into the sack and pulled out a garment. He laid it flat on the pristine desk. Clara stepped closer, her brow furrowing. It was a shirt, but not a gentleman's shirt. It was made of cheap, rough-spun linen, stained yellow with sweat and darkened in patches by something that looked suspiciously like dried blood. It smelled heavily of damp stone, sickness, and the unmistakable, sour tang of the slums. Following the shirt came a pair of worn, worsted trousers, the knees patched with mismatched thread, the hems frayed into nothing. She looked up at the Duke. "This is workhouse clothing." "It is," Haworth said. His voice cracked just a fraction before he wrestled it back into a monotone. 4 days ago, my younger brother Edward died in the Marshalsea debtors' prison. Clara froze. The Marshalsea, a place where the city shoved its unwanted to rot in the damp and the dark. "These were the clothes he died in," Haworth continued, his hands resting flat on the desk, inches from the soiled linen. "He was in there for 6 months. I put him there. I refused to pay his gambling debts. I thought the shock of the prison would sober him. I thought it would make him a man." He swallowed hard. "It made him a corpse." Clara said nothing. She knew better than to offer pity to a man holding a whip. She just looked at the clothes, reading the history in the frayed seams, the poor stitching where someone, maybe Edward himself, had tried to mend a tear. On Friday, the House of Lords convenes to vote on the new poor laws, the ones designed to cut parish relief. I am expected to deliver the closing remarks supporting the cuts. Haworth stepped back, gesturing to a dress form in the corner of the room. Draped over it was a magnificent set of parliamentary robes, scarlet velvet, lined with pristine white ermine, heavy with gold braid. "Here is your commission, Miss Miller," Haworth said, finally looking her in the eye. "I want you to take my brother's rags. I want you to unpick them, wash them, and cut them down. And then I want you to sew them into the lining of my robes, every inch of them. I want the rough linen against my back. I want the frayed wool across my shoulders. I want to carry the weight of what I did into that chamber. Clara stared at him. It was madness. It was a macabre, self-indulgent act of penance. "You want to wear his death," she stated, her voice devoid of judgment, merely confirming the facts. "I want to wear my guilt," Hayworth corrected softly. "Can you do it? Without altering the outward appearance of the robes? No one must know. If the other lords find out, they will dismiss my speech as the ravings of a grieving madman. It must look perfect on the outside, and it must feel like hell on the inside." Clara looked at the velvet. She looked at the blood-stained linen. She calculated the hours, the tension, the sheer physical labor of sewing coarse linen through heavy velvet without a single stitch showing on the scarlet face. "It will take 3 days of blinding work," she said. "The fabrics will fight each other. Velvet stretches, cheap linen holds stiff. I will pay you £50. Clara's heart stopped. £50 was 2 years' wages. It was a way out of the freezing shop. It was independence. She reached into her wooden box and pulled out her heavy shears. "Show me to my workroom, Your Grace. We have a lot of seams to rip." Hayworth did not put her in a servant's workroom. He installed her in a small, private antechamber, directly adjacent to his study. It had no windows, but it was ablaze with a dozen wax candles that cast a steady, warm glow over a sturdy oak table. A silver tray holding a teapot, sliced cold beef, and fresh bread sat ignored on a side table. Clara started with the smell. She demanded a large copper basin, boiling water, and a block of strong lye soap. Hayworth brought them himself, dismissing the bewildered housemaid at the door. He stood in the doorway, watching in silence as Clara submerged his brother's soiled garments into the steaming water. The water turned a murky, vile brown almost instantly. Clara rolled up her sleeves, exposing forearms corded with the lean muscle of years of manual labor. She plunged her bare hands into the scalding water, her face impassive. The heat burned, but the cold of the streets had taught her to ignore discomfort. She scrubbed the coarse linen against itself, working the lye into the stains. "The blood won't come out entirely," she said over her shoulder, the harsh smell of soap masking the rot. It set in. Heat binds blood to linen. "Leave it," Hayworth said. He crossed the room and stood beside her. He looked at the brown water. "I don't want it clean. I just want it free of disease." Clara wrung the shirt out with a violent twist, her knuckles white. "You think wearing dirt makes you honorable, Your Grace?" "It doesn't. It just makes you dirty." Hayworth's head snapped toward her. He was unaccustomed to being spoken to with such blunt disregard for his title. "You have a sharp tongue for a seamstress. I have a practical tongue. I deal in threads, needles, and measurements. I don't deal in metaphors." She draped the wet garments over the brass fire guard to dry, the heat of the hearth immediately sending up a cloud of damp steam. "You want to punish yourself. That's fine, but don't expect the fabric to forgive you. This linen is cheap. It will chafe your skin raw beneath the weight of that velvet." "That is the point." Clara turned to him, wiping her wet, reddened hands on her apron. "Guilt is a luxury of the rich, Duke. The poor don't have time to feel guilty about the people who die. We just survive the ones who don't. You put your brother in the Marshalsea because you thought you could control him. You couldn't. Now you're paying me £50 to build you a hair shirt." For a moment, Clara thought she had gone too far. The air in the room grew thin. Hayworth stared down at her, his dark eyes flashing with a sudden, sharp anger. His hands curled into fists at his sides. He could throw her out. He could ruin her. Instead, the anger shattered, leaving behind a hollow, ruinous grief. He pulled a wooden chair from the corner and sank into it, dragging a hand down his face. He was 22, Hayworth whispered to the empty room. He loved music. He played the pianoforte like a madman, always rushing to the tempo. He gambled because he was bored, and he was bored because I gave him an allowance and nothing to do. Clara stood by the fire. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. She didn't offer him a platitude. She didn't tell him it wasn't his fault. She knew exactly whose fault it was. "Go back to your study, Your Grace," she said softly, her tone losing its sharp edge. "I need to start unpicking the robes. I cannot do that with you staring at me." He nodded slowly, standing up like an old man. "Ring the bell if you need more light." By midnight, the antechamber looked like a battlefield. Clara sat at the heavy oak table. The magnificent scarlet parliamentary robes spread out before her like a gutted beast. With her tiny, razor-sharp seam ripper, she was systematically destroying hundreds of hours of a master tailor's work. She severed the tiny silk stitches, holding the ermine lining to the velvet shell. Snap, snap, snap. It was agonizingly slow. One wrong move, one slip of the blade, and she would slice through the velvet, ruining the garment entirely. Her eyes ached, stinging in the candlelight. Her back throbbed in time with her pulse. Beside the robes lay Edward's dried clothes. She had taken her shears to them an hour ago, cutting along the seams, dismantling the shape of the man who had worn them. She flattened the linen and worsted wool into raw, jagged panels. At 2 a.m, the door clicked open. Hayworth entered. He had discarded his formal coat and cravat. His white shirt was open at the collar, his hair slightly disheveled. He carried 2 small glasses and a crystal decanter of amber liquid. He didn't say a word. He simply set a glass down near Clara's elbow, poured a generous measure of brandy, and poured one for himself. He leaned against the edge of the table, watching her hands. Clara paused, rubbing her cramping thumb. She picked up the glass and downed it in one swift motion. The brandy burned a fiery trail down her throat, settling as a warm knot in her stomach. "Thank you. Your hands are bleeding," he noted quietly, pointing to a tiny red smear on the edge of the white ermine she had just detached. Clara looked down. The side of her index finger was split, the dry skin cracking under the relentless pressure of gripping the seam ripper. She calmly reached into her pocket, pulled out a scrap of clean muslin, and wrapped it tightly around the cut, tying it off with a spare piece of thread, using only her teeth and her right hand. "It happens," she said. "The velvet is heavy. It fights back." "Show me." Clara looked up, frowning. "Show you what? How you do it?" Hayworth stepped around the table, pulling up a chair beside hers. He was too close. She could smell the brandy on his breath, mixed with the clean scent of sandalwood soap. "I want to know how it is constructed. If I am to wear it, I want to understand how it holds together." Clara hesitated. Men of his station did not ask about the mechanics of labor. But there was an earnest, desperate curiosity in his eyes. He needed an anchor. He needed to focus on something physical, something real, to keep the ghosts at bay. She picked up a panel of the raw workhouse linen and laid it against the back of the velvet shell. "A garment is all about tension," Clara explained, her voice dropping into the steady, rhythmic cadence she used when teaching the younger apprentices. "The outside fabric, the velvet, is the presentation. It's heavy, it falls beautifully, but it has no structure of its own. It relies on the lining to keep it from stretching out of shape." She threaded a needle with heavy black cotton thread. "But you can't just slap 2 fabrics together. If I stitch this cheap, stiff linen directly to the velvet in a straight line, it will pucker. The linen doesn't stretch, The velvet does. When you move, the thread will snap. So I have to use a floating stitch. She pushed the needle through the linen, catching just a single, microscopic thread of the velvet underneath, and pulled it through. I leave slack in the thread, just a fraction of an inch. It creates a hidden gap between the inside and the outside. The two fabrics are bound together, but they are allowed to move independently. They tolerate each other. Hayworth stared at the tiny, almost invisible indentation her needle had made. Bound together but separate, he murmured. Yes. Clara tied a knot and snapped the thread with her teeth. It takes 3 times as long. But it's the only way to hide the truth on the inside from the world on the outside. He looked at her, his dark eyes locking onto hers. The silence in the room shifted, growing heavier, charged with a sudden, startling intimacy. In the candlelight, Clara saw not a duke, but a broken man desperately trying to stitch his own shattered conscience back together. "Will it hold?" he asked, his voice a low rasp. "I'm the best, Your Grace," Clara said quietly. "It will hold." By the evening of the second day, the physical toll of the work began to show. Clara had slept for perhaps 4 hours, curled on a narrow cot in the corner of the room. Her fingers were cramped into permanent claws, her knuckles swollen and aching. The floor around her was a sea of discarded thread snips and trimmings. The robes were taking shape. The interior was a patchwork of tragedy. The back panel, spanning from shoulder to waist, was lined entirely with the rough, blood-stained linen of Edward's shirt. The heavy worsted wool from the trousers was expertly pieced into the sleeves. Over this, Clara was painstakingly reattaching the pristine white ermine, securing it so that it hid the rags from sight, but leaving the edges unstitched on the inside so the rough fabrics would lay directly against Hayworth's skin. It was a masterpiece of hidden suffering. Hayworth had spent most of the day in the room with her. He brought a stack of parliamentary briefs to the small side table, ostensibly working on his speech for the House of Lords. But Clara noticed he rarely turned a page. He just listened to the rhythmic shh thwip of her needle pulling through the heavy fabric. It seemed to calm him. "You haven't asked me why I'm voting for the poor laws," Hayworth said suddenly, breaking a 2-hour silence. The clock on the mantel ticked toward 9 o'clock. Clara didn't look up from her stitching. "It's not my place to ask about politics. But you have an opinion. Everyone who buys their coal by the bucket has an opinion, Your Grace." She pushed the needle through a thick seam, wrapping the thread around her thimble to pull it tight. "You are voting to cut parish relief. You believe the poor are idle. You believe that if you starve them a little more, they will magically find work that doesn't exist. I believe the current system enables dependency," he recited, though the conviction in his voice was brittle. "It drains the national treasury to support men who will not work." Clara finally stopped. She lowered the robe to her lap and looked at him. Edward was a gentleman. He had a title, an allowance, and an education, and he gambled it away. Did you let him starve in the Marshalsea to cure his dependency, or to punish him for embarrassing you? Hayworth flinched as if she had struck him. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping violently against the floorboards. Clara held her breath. She had pushed too far. She braced herself for the explosion. Instead, Hayworth turned away, leaning his forehead against the cool plaster of the wall. His shoulders shook. It was a silent, terrifying display of grief. A man of his station didn't cry in front of the hired help. He didn't break. Clara set her needle down. She stood up, her joints popping in protest, and walked over to the side table. She poured a glass of plain water from the pitcher and carried it over to him. She didn't touch him. She just held the glass out, "My younger sister died when I was 12, Clara said to his back, her voice startlingly gentle in the quiet room. Her name was Mary. It was a winter like this one. We couldn't afford coal. She caught a fever. I remember thinking that if I just held her tight enough, my body heat would save her. It didn't. I blamed myself for years." Hayworth turned his head slowly, looking at the glass of water, then up at her face. "How did you stop blaming yourself?" he asked, his voice thick. "I didn't," Clara said honestly. "But I realized that carrying her ghost around wasn't keeping her warm. It was just making me cold. I had to learn to sew. I had to survive." She pressed the glass into his hand. His fingers brushed hers. They were freezing. Before Hayworth could drink, heavy, hurried footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Clara froze. The servants were strictly forbidden from coming down this wing. "Roland!" A sharp, aristocratic voice rang out from the hallway. "Are you in there? The butler tried to block my path, the insolent toad." Hayworth's eyes widened in sheer panic. "My aunt, Lady Agatha." "The robes," Clara hissed. The velvet parliamentary shell was currently half-turned inside out on the table, the crude, stained workhouse linen blatantly exposed. If Lady Agatha walked in and saw the Duke of Haworth lining his state robes with the rags of his disgraced dead brother, the scandal would destroy him before he even set foot in Parliament. He would be institutionalized. The door handle began to rattle. "Roland, open this door." Hayworth stepped toward the table, his hands frantic, trying to fold the massive, heavy velvet over itself to hide the linen. But the fabric was stiff, the ermine bulky. It wouldn't hide. "Leave it," Clara whispered fiercely. She lunged at the table. Grabbing the collar of the robes, she dragged the entire heavy mass of velvet, fur, and linen off the table. She sat down hard in her chair and threw the robes over her own lap, bunching the fabric up so the scarlet velvet covered her knees and chest. Then, with a frantic yank, she pulled the pins from her hair. The heavy, dark mass tumbled down around her shoulders in complete disarray. She unbuttoned the top 3 buttons of her plain grey dress, exposing her collarbone, and kicked one of her shoes off under the table. Hayworth stared at her, uncomprehending, just as the heavy oak door burst open. Lady Agatha stood in the doorway, a formidable woman wrapped in layers of purple silk and black lace. She took one step into the room, her eyes darting from Hayworth, who was standing frozen near the wall, to Clara, sitting in the corner, flushed, dishevelled, and half buried under Hayworth's parliamentary robes. The silence in the room was absolute. Lady Agatha's jaw dropped. A slow, dark flush crept up her neck. She looked at Clara's bare collarbone, her loose hair, the discarded shoe peeking out from beneath the scarlet velvet. "Good God," Lady Agatha breathed, clutching her reticule to her chest as if it could shield her from the depravity. "Roland, what is the meaning of this?" Clara looked down, playing the part. She let her face burn with artificial shame, pulling the velvet tighter around herself as if trying to hide. Hayworth stared at Clara. In a fraction of a second, he understood what she had done. She was a respectable, working-class woman. To be found in a locked room with a duke, unbuttoned and dishevelled, was ruinous to her reputation. She had turned herself into his secret mistress to protect his broken heart. Hayworth straightened his spine. The panic vanished, replaced by the icy, arrogant mask of a duke. He stepped between Lady Agatha and Clara, shielding Clara from view. "It means, Aunt," Hayworth said, his voice dripping with bored condescension, "that you have interrupted a private fitting, and I would thank you to learn how to knock." Lady Agatha did not retreat quietly. She drew herself up, her silk skirts rustling like a nest of disturbed vipers. She looked at Hayworth, then shot a final, venomous glare at the pile of scarlet velvet and the woman hidden beneath it. "You are a disgrace to your father's memory," she spat. "Consorting with gutter trash in your own study, on the eve of your most important address to the lords." "My affairs are my own, Aunt. Close the door on your way out." Agatha slammed it so hard, the candelabra on the desk rattled. The silence that followed was heavy, ringing in Clara's ears. She didn't move. She stayed perfectly still beneath the crushing weight of the robes, waiting to ensure the old woman's footsteps faded entirely down the corridor. Only when the house fell dead quiet did she push the heavy velvet off her lap. She stood up. Her hands were shaking, just slightly, as she reached for the discarded shoe. She slipped it on, then calmly began to rebutton the high collar of her grey dress. Hayworth turned to her. The aristocratic mask had dissolved, leaving him pale and unsteady. He looked at her, buttoning her collar, at the scattered hairpins on the floor, and the magnitude of what had just happened hit him like a physical blow. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" he asked. His voice was a harsh whisper. "I protected my £50, Clara said. She found a pin on the rug and shoved it into her hair, twisting the dark strands into a rough knot. "You protected my secret, at the cost of your own reputation." Hayworth closed the distance between them. He didn't touch her, but his proximity was a pressure of its own. "My aunt is the worst gossip in Mayfair. By tomorrow afternoon, half of London will know I have a seamstress hidden in my study. They will assume you are my whore. Let them assume." Clara picked up her heavy shears from the table, her face an unreadable mask. "The people in Mayfair do not buy their clothes from Gable's tailoring, and the people in the rookeries do not care who a duke sleeps with, so long as the coin is good. My reputation was never my currency, Your Grace. My speed is. Do not diminish this." Hayworth's voice cracked. He reached out, his fingers hovering an inch from her wrist before he forced his hand to drop. "You threw yourself to the wolves to save a man who has done nothing but bark orders at you." Clara looked up. She met his gaze, refusing to soften her own. "I threw myself over a pile of half-stitched fabric, because if she saw the workhouse linen, you would be ruined. And if you are ruined, I don't get paid. Don't romanticize poverty, Duke. We are practical creatures." She turned back to the table, hauling the massive robes up and spreading them out once more. The rough linen lining was still exposed, waiting for the final layer of ermine to cage it in. "Sit down, Your Grace," she commanded quietly. "We lost 10 minutes, and I am tired." Hayworth stared at her back for a long moment. Then, slowly, he walked to the chair opposite hers. He didn't pick up his parliamentary briefs. He just watched her hands. The rhythm of the needle resumed. Push, catch, pull. By 4 in the morning, the silence had stretched to the breaking point. The fire had died down to glowing embers. Clara's fingers were stiff, moving entirely on muscle memory. The skin on her thumb was rubbed raw, the needle slipping dangerously close to the quick with every stitch. "Why did your sister die?" Hayworth asked suddenly. The question hung in the cold air. Clara didn't stop sewing. "The landlord raised the rent," she said, her voice flat, devoid of the tears she had shed a decade ago. "My father was a bricklayer. He broke his arm. We couldn't pay. So the landlord took the stove." She pulled the black thread taut. It was January. Mary was small. She coughed for a week. Then she stopped. Clara tied a knot. "Poor laws you are voting for tomorrow. They dictate that a family must enter the workhouse to receive parish relief." My father refused to go. Workhouses separate the men from the women, the children from the parents. He said he would rather we freeze together than starve apart. So we froze. Haworth looked at the fire. The reflection of the embers danced in his dark eyes. Edward hated the cold, he murmured. When we were boys, he used to sneak into the kitchens and sleep by the hearth. The cooks would find him covered in ash. The Marshalsea is damp, Clara stated. It was a cruel fact, but they were beyond politeness now. Damp is worse than cold. It gets into the bones. Haworth squeezed his eyes shut. I know. He didn't die because he was weak, Duke. He died because you put a boy who needed a hearth into a stone box. Clara pushed the needle through the final hem of the left sleeve. But you know that. That's why you are wearing his clothes. She snapped the thread with her teeth. The sleeves are done. The third day dawned grey and hostile. The antechamber smelled of lye, sweat, and burning wax. Clara had not slept. She operated in a state of hyper-focused delirium, the kind of exhaustion that sharpens the edges of the world until they cut. At noon, Haworth brought a tray of roasted pheasant and strong black tea. Clara ate standing up, her eyes never leaving the robes on the table. It was nearly finished. The magnificent scarlet velvet was flawless on the outside. The heavy gold braid lay perfectly flat across the shoulders. But inside, concealed beneath a loose border of white ermine, lay Edward's ruin. "It is time," Clara said, her voice hoarse. It was 3 o'clock. The House of Lords convened at 5. Haworth stopped pacing. He looked at the robes. The velvet seemed to absorb the light in the room, heavy and imposing. "Take off your coat," Clara ordered. He stripped off his black broadcloth coat, tossing it onto a chair. He untied his cravat, his fingers clumsy, and pulled it free. "The shirt, too." Haworth hesitated. A gentleman never exposed his shirt sleeves in the presence of a woman, let alone stripped to his bare skin. But the rules of society had burned away hours ago in this stifling, candle-lit room. He unbuttoned the fine white linen and shrugged it off. His torso was lean, the muscles drawn tight with tension. Clara didn't blush. She didn't look away. She picked up the massive robes. They weighed nearly 20 pounds. "Turn around," she said. Haworth turned his back to her. Clara stepped up behind him. She lifted the heavy velvet and draped it over his shoulders. The moment the rough, unwashed workhouse linen made contact with his bare skin, Haworth gasped. It was worse than he had imagined. The cheap, stiff fibers dug into his shoulders like spun glass. The coarse wool from Edward's patched trousers scraped mercilessly against his forearms. And beneath the smell of the new velvet, the faint, sickening odor of the Marshalsea rose up to meet him. He staggered forward, his knees buckling under the sheer psychological weight of it. "Stand up!" Clara snapped. She dropped the shears and grabbed him by the lapels of the robes, hauling him backward. Haworth leaned against her pull, his head dropping forward. His breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. "It burns!" he choked out. "God, Clara, it burns!" It was the first time he had used her given name. It slipped out in the dark, desperate space between them. "It's supposed to," she said, her voice fiercely steady. She didn't let him go. She gripped the scarlet velvet, her knuckles white, holding the Duke of Haworth upright. "You asked for his death. I sewed it for you. Now bear it." He closed his eyes. The rough linen chafed his collarbone. He could feel the exact place where Edward had worn through the fabric at the elbow. He could feel the dried blood against his spine. "I can't walk into that chamber," he whispered. The arrogance was entirely gone. He was just a terrified, grieving brother. "I can't stand before them and tell them to starve the poor while wearing this." "Then don't." Clara stepped around him, forcing him to look at her. "Change your speech. I am the Duke of Haworth." My family has supported the Cuts for a century. The party expects. The party expects a puppet, Clara interrupted, her eyes blazing. You hired me to build you a hair shirt because you are a coward. You want to feel the pain in secret so you can go out there and be a monster in public and feel absolved. No. She let go of his lapels and stepped back. If you wear my work into that room, you wear it honestly. If this fabric touches your skin, you remember my sister. You remember your brother. You remember that the decisions you make in that warm, gilded room freeze people to death in the dark. Hayworth stared at her. Her hair was a mess. Her face was pale with exhaustion. Her hands were scarred and bleeding from sewing his conscience into existence. She was magnificent. He slowly straightened his spine. The rough linen scraped like sandpaper against his back, a violent, physical reminder of the cost of his pride. He welcomed the pain. He anchored himself to it. Is the outside perfect? He asked quietly. There is not a single stitch out of place, Clara replied. They will see a duke. Only you will know you are a beggar. He nodded once. He reached out and, gently, surprisingly, took her injured hand. He looked down at the split skin, the dried blood around her fingernails. Come with me, he said. Clara frowned. Where? To Westminster, to the House of Lords. He didn't let go of her hand. I cannot do this alone. I need you to see the fabric hold. The Duke's carriage was a lacquered beast, bearing the Haworth crest in gold leaf on the doors. Usually, it commanded the streets, a silent demand for the rabble to clear the way. Today, from the inside, it felt like a hearse. Clara sat on the plush velvet squabs, feeling entirely out of place in her plain grey wool dress and worn cloak. She had washed her face and repinned her hair, but the deep purple shadows under her eyes betrayed her. Opposite her sat Haworth. He looked terrifying in his state robes. The scarlet velvet caught the dim afternoon light, the white ermine immaculate around his neck. To the outside world, he was the picture of aristocratic power. But Clara watched the slight, involuntary twitch in his jaw every time the carriage hit a cobblestone. Every jolt dragged the coarse linen across his bare back. He was sweating. A thin sheen of moisture coated his pale forehead. Breathe, Your Grace, Clara said quietly, her eyes on the window. It feels like it's shrinking, Hayworth ground out, his hands gripping the leather straps beside the window, so tightly the leather creaked. The wool in the sleeves, it's pulling. It's just the floating stitches settling, she lied. The stitches wouldn't shrink, but the coarse wool would bite deeper as his body heat warmed it. Keep your arms slightly bent. Don't fight the fabric. The carriage turned onto Whitehall. The streets grew crowded, the fog thickening as the sun began to dip below the buildings. Through the glass, Clara watched the city. She saw a mudlark, shivering by the frozen edge of the Thames. She saw a woman carrying a bundle of scavenged coal, her face grey with exhaustion. Hayworth saw them too. For years he had looked out of this very carriage and seen a nuisance, a political problem to be solved with ledgers and laws. Now, the rough fabric digging into his skin forced a terrible, visceral translation. Every scrape against his back was a cough in the dark. Every pull on his shoulders was a day without fire. Clara, he said. It was the second time. She turned from the window. If I speak against the Cuts, he said, his voice low, vibrating with a terrifying realization, I will be ostracized. The Tories will brand me a traitor. My aunt will petition to have me deemed incompetent. I know. I will lose my standing in the house. Clara looked at the gold braid on his chest. Yes. He let out a short, hollow laugh. And what does a duke do when he loses his standing? He learns to walk in the cold, Clara said softly. Like the rest of us, the carriage ground to a halt. Outside, the imposing stone facade of the Palace of Westminster loomed in the fog. Footmen were already rushing forward to open the door. Haworth didn't move immediately. He looked at Clara. The space between them was charged, electric with the weight of the past 3 days. They had shared no vows, no romantic declarations, but they were bound together by something far stronger than affection. They were bound by the blood in the linen and the thread in her hands. "Will you wait?" he asked. "In the gallery. I secured a pass from my secretary." He reached into the pocket of the robes and pulled out a small, embossed card. He held it out to her. Clara looked at the card. It was an invitation into the world that had killed her sister. It was a chance to watch the Duke of Haworth burn his own house down. She took the card. Her bruised fingers brushed against his. "I will watch the fabric hold," she promised. Haworth nodded. He turned and stepped out of the carriage. Clara watched through the window as he walked up the stone steps. The wind caught the heavy scarlet robes, whipping them around his ankles. He didn't flinch. He walked with the stiff, deliberate gait of a man carrying a corpse on his back. The footman opened Clara's door. She stepped out onto the damp pavement. She didn't follow Haworth through the grand entrance. She was directed to a side door, a narrow stairwell reserved for the public and the press. She climbed the stone steps, her legs trembling with fatigue. The air grew warmer, thick with the smell of polished wood, expensive cologne, and damp wool. When she finally pushed through the heavy oak doors into the public gallery, the noise hit her like a physical blow. The chamber below was packed. Hundreds of men in dark coats and state robes milled about, their voices a rising crescendo of debate and laughter. It was a sea of power, entirely detached from the freezing streets just beyond the walls. Clara gripped the wooden railing of the gallery. She scanned the floor. There he was. Haworth sat on the front benches, a splash of brilliant scarlet among the dark wood. He sat perfectly still, his back rigidly straight. He didn't speak to the men around him. He was a statue, enduring the agonizing scrape of the linen in absolute silence. A heavy brass bell rang out, silencing the room. The Lord Chancellor stood up, unrolling a long piece of parchment. "The House will now hear the closing remarks on the proposed amendments to the Poor Relief Act of 1816. The Chancellor's voice echoed off the vaulted ceiling. "The chair recognizes His Grace, the Duke of Haworth." A murmur of anticipation rippled through the chamber. The Tories leaned back, expecting their champion to deliver the final, crushing blow to the parish relief funds. Haworth stood up. He moved slowly, deliberately. From the gallery, Clara could see the slight hesitation as the heavy velvet pulled against his bleeding shoulders. He stepped up to the dispatch box. He looked out over the sea of faces, then raised his head, his eyes scanning the shadowed balcony. He found Clara. For one fleeting second, across the massive expanse of the chamber, they locked eyes. Then Haworth looked down at his notes. He reached out with both hands and pushed the stack of papers off the dispatch box. They fluttered to the floor like dead leaves. The chamber went dead silent. Haworth gripped the edges of the wooden box. Under the brilliant scarlet velvet, the rough workhouse linen bit into his flesh. "My lords," Haworth began, his voice ringing out, clear and devastatingly cold. "I stand before you today to tell you that we are wrong." The silence in the chamber was not respectful. It was the breathless, dangerous quiet of a bomb before the fuse meets the powder. "We speak of the poor as if they are a ledger," Haworth's voice carried to the highest wooden rafters, entirely devoid of the polished oratorical cadence he usually employed. We speak of parish relief as a drain on the crown. We debate the morality of starving a man to cure him of his idleness. I have sat in this room and voted for the cold. I have voted for the damp. He gripped the dispatch box harder. The heavy worsted wool in the sleeves dragged against his forearms. 4 days ago, I buried my brother. A shockwave of murmurs rippled through the opposing benches. Personal grief was never weaponized in the House of Lords. It was considered grotesque. He died in the Marshalsea, Haworth continued, his voice rising, cutting through the murmurs like a rusted blade. He died because he could not pay his debts, and because I believed the stone walls would teach him discipline. They did not teach him. They froze the life out of his lungs. An older lord in the second row stood up, his face purple. "My Lord Chancellor, I must object. The Duke's personal tragedies are not the subject of this bill." "Sit down, Carlyle," Haworth snapped. The sheer, raw venom in his command physically forced the older man back into his seat. Haworth took a step away from the box. The movement shifted the 20 pounds of velvet on his shoulders. The coarse, blood-stained linen bit deep into the skin over his collarbone. He welcomed it. It kept him focused. You vote to cut the parish relief because you think the workhouses will absorb the destitute. You think tearing fathers from their children will build character. He looked up at the gallery. He didn't look at Clara, but his eyes swept the cheap wooden benches where the public sat. We sit in this room, wrapped in velvet and ermine, warmed by 3 roaring fires, and we legislate the exact temperature at which a family should be allowed to freeze to death before the state intervenes. The shouting began. The chamber erupted. Tories stood, waving their order papers, bellowing for the Chancellor to restore decorum. The Whigs across the aisle were staring at Haworth with a mixture of horror and calculating awe. Haworth did not raise his voice to shout over them. He waited. He stood perfectly rigid, letting the coarse linen scrape against his back, letting the heat of the room turn the cheap wool in his sleeves into a suffocating vice. He stood there until the sheer abnormality of his silence forced the room to quiet down. "I withdraw my support for the amendment," Haworth said. His voice was a rasp now, the physical toll of the garment bleeding into his vocal cords. "I will not vote to plunge another 1,000 souls into the dark. If we are to be the lords of this realm, we must govern the living, not legislate the dead." He turned his back on the Chancellor. It was an incredible breach of protocol. To turn one's back on the chair before being formally dismissed was an insult that bordered on parliamentary treason. Haworth walked up the center aisle. The men he had dined with, the men he had grown up with, stepped back as he passed, pulling their robes away as if he were carrying a plague. The scarlet velvet trailed heavily behind him. Beneath it, his back was bleeding. In the gallery, Clara let out a long, shuddering breath. The thread had held. The corridor outside the public gallery was empty. Clara stood by the narrow window, watching the fog swallow the gas lamps on the street below. The heavy wooden door from the main chamber level opened with a dull groan. Haworth walked out. He was alone. No secretaries fluttered around him. No political allies trailed behind to offer congratulations or demand explanations. He had just set fire to a century of family political standing in less than 5 minutes. He saw Clara and stopped. The color was completely drained from his face. The state robes, which had looked so magnificent an hour ago, now looked like a trap. The gold braid seemed to weigh his shoulders down. He walked toward her, his movements stiff and agonizingly slow. "It's done," he said. Clara looked at his collar. A faint, terrible pink stain was just beginning to bloom on the pristine white cravat at his neck, where the rough edge of the workhouse linen had rubbed the skin raw. "You are bleeding," she noted. Her voice was steady, perfectly flat. "Yes, the carriage is awaiting." The ride back to Haworth House was silent. It was not the silence of strangers, but the heavy, exhausted quiet of soldiers returning from a trench. Haworth leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, refusing to let his back touch the velvet squabs. His breathing was shallow. When they reached the antechamber where they had spent the last 3 days, the fire was dead. The room was freezing. Clara did not wait for an invitation. She walked straight to the table, picking up her heavy shears. "Take it off," she ordered. Haworth stood in the center of the room. He reached for the heavy gold clasps at his chest, but his fingers were shaking too badly to manage the intricate hooks. He fumbled, cursing softly under his breath. Clara stepped up to him. She batted his hands away. "Stand still." She unhooked the clasps. She gripped the heavy scarlet velvet at the shoulders. "This is going to tear the scabs," she warned. "Do it." Clara pulled the robes backward, peeling them off his body. Haworth let out a sharp, involuntary hiss of pain, his knees buckling slightly. Clara tossed the massive 20-pound garment onto the floor. It landed with a heavy, dead thud. The pristine ermine spilled over the rug, exposing the grotesque, blood-stained, sweat-soaked workhouse linen of the interior. Haworth stood in his ruined white shirt. The back was soaked through with fresh blood. The coarse wool of the sleeves had rubbed his forearms raw. He looked like a man who had been flogged. Clara walked to the washstand. She poured freezing water from the pitcher into the copper basin. She grabbed a clean towel, dipped it in the icy water, and walked back to him. "Turn around." He obeyed. She unbuttoned the ruined shirt and pulled it off his shoulders. His back was a lattice of angry red welts and weeping abrasions. The cheap, stiff linen had acted exactly as Clara knew it would. It had flayed him. She pressed the freezing, wet towel against his spine. The cold water hit the raw nerves. Haworth's head dropped forward, a long, ragged exhale shuddering through his chest. He didn't pull away. He leaned backward, pressing into the biting cold of the towel, letting it numb the burning. Clara wiped away the blood, her hands clinically precise. She wasn't gentle, but she was efficient. She didn't offer pity. She offered the exact thing she had offered for 3 days. A brutal, practical reality. "It will scar," she said, tossing the bloody towel into the basin. "Good." Haworth turned to face her. The arrogance was gone. The title felt utterly irrelevant in the cold, dim room. He was just a man, hollowed out and shivering. He walked over to his desk. He opened the top drawer and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. He carried it back to Clara and placed it in her hands. The weight of the gold coins inside shifted with a dull clink. £50, he said. Clara looked down at the pouch. It was heavy. It was independence. It was a fire that would never go out, a door she could finally lock from the inside. "The commission is complete, Your Grace," she said. She didn't curtsy. She just met his eyes. "What will you do now?" he asked. "I will buy a shop, far away from Mayfair. I will sew clothes for people who need them to stay warm, not to hide their sins." Haworth nodded slowly. "I hope your fire never dies, Clara. I will buy my own coal, Duke. It won't." She turned and walked out of the room. She didn't look back at the discarded robes on the floor. She walked down the servants' stairs, out the back door, and disappeared into the freezing London fog. The sign above the door read, "C. Miller, Tailor and Mender." It was not a large shop, and it was located in Spitalfields, a district where the air smelled permanently of boiling cabbage and wet wool. But the glass in the window was clean, the iron stove inside was roaring, and Clara owned every single brick. It had been 2 months. Clara sat behind a sturdy oak counter. pushing a needle through a heavy sailor's coat. The calluses on her fingers had thickened. She was no longer the iron-fingered girl of Gable's tailoring. She was the proprietor. The bell above the door chimed. Clara didn't look up immediately. She finished the seam, tied the knot, and snapped the thread with her teeth. "I said no more alterations on credit, Mr. Higgins. You will have to—" She stopped. Standing in the doorway of her shop was Roland. He was not wearing velvet. He was not wearing a silk cravat or a beaver hat. He was dressed in a plain, dark grey broadcloth coat, the kind worn by merchants and clerks. It was well made, but completely devoid of aristocratic embellishment. His face was weathered, the dark circles under his eyes deeper, but the frantic, haunted energy that had consumed him 2 months ago was gone. He looked exhausted, but he looked grounded. Clara slowly lowered the sailor's coat to the counter. "You are a long way from Westminster," she said. Her voice gave nothing away. He closed the door behind him, stepping into the warmth of the shop. "I don't go to Westminster much these days. The Tories have effectively barred me from the committees. My aunt has disowned me. She is currently trying to convince a magistrate that I have gone mad." "Have you?" "I don't think so." He walked toward the counter. He didn't look around the shop with the disdain she expected. He looked at the heavy bolts of durable, practical fabric lining the walls. "I sold the town carriage. I closed off the east wing of Haworth House. I am using the funds to back a petition for a new hospital in Suffolk. For the debtors." Clara watched him. "That won't win you any friends in Mayfair." "I don't want friends in Mayfair." He stopped at the counter. The wood separated them, a physical barrier between two worlds that had violently collided and then snapped apart. "The robes," Haworth said quietly. "I burned them in the courtyard. It took 3 hours for the velvet to catch." Clara nodded. "Heat binds blood to linen, but fire takes everything." Haworth reached into the pocket of his grey coat. He pulled out a small, roughly folded piece of paper. He placed it on the oak counter and slid it toward her. Clara didn't touch it. She looked at him. "I already have my £50. I don't take charity." "It isn't charity. It's a lease agreement." Clara frowned, picking up the paper and unfolding it. It was a deed for a massive abandoned warehouse near the docks. "The hospital in Suffolk needs a ward for the cold months," Haworth explained, his dark eyes fixed on her. "It needs blankets. It needs heavy coats. It needs someone who understands exactly how to build a garment that keeps the damp out. The board wanted to hire a military contractor. I told them they needed the fastest, most precise cutter in London." Clara stared at the deed. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It wasn't a bouquet of hothouse flowers or a diamond necklace. It was a mountain of grueling, relentless work. It was perfect. She looked up at him. "The military contractors use cheap thread. It rots in the damp." "That is exactly what I told them. I would need 10 seamstresses, good ones. I won't hire girls who don't know how to lock a seam." "You would be the master tailor," Haworth said. "You hire whoever you want. You run the floor. I just secure the funding." Clara leaned forward, resting her forearms on the counter. She studied his face. The aristocratic mark was completely gone. In its place was a man who had finally learned the weight of the world and was asking for help to carry it. "Why me, Roland?" She used his name, deliberately, stripping away the title just as he had stripped away his velvet. He didn't flinch. He leaned forward too, bridging the gap over the oak counter. "Because you didn't let me hide," he said softly. "Because you made me wear the linen. I spent my entire life standing on a balcony, throwing coins into the dark. I need someone to show me how to walk in the cold." Clara looked at his hands resting on the counter. They were pale, aristocratic hands, but there was a new roughness to the knuckles. He had been working. She reached out. She didn't take his hand, but she let her fingertips brush against his wrist. The contact was electric, sharp and undeniable, rooted not in fantasy, but in a shared, brutal understanding of the world. "The warehouse is drafty," Clara said, her voice dropping, the cynical edge softening just a fraction. "We will need 3 iron stoves, and I don't work on Sundays." A slow, genuine smile broke across Haworth's face, easing the harsh lines of his grief. It was the first time she had ever seen him smile. 3 stoves, he agreed, "and Sundays are yours." Clara picked up her heavy shears from the counter. She slipped them into the pocket of her apron. She looked around her small, warm shop, and then back at the Duke, who had walked away from everything to stand in it. "All right," Clara said. "Let's go measure the space." Did Clara and the Duke's defiance against a broken system resonate with you? Their story proved true strength isn't found in velvet and titles, but in the courage to face the cold truth and the grit to stitch something better together. If you were captivated by this grounded, historical drama of sacrifice, redemption, and unconventional partnership, hit that like button to let me know. Share this story with fellow historical fiction lovers who crave realism over fairy tales. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more deeply human, immersive audio stories every single week.